This video will be looking into the question of how useful is genre theory. So, what is a genre? A genre is a specific type of music, film, or writing. For example, there are genres such as fantasy, war, thriller, and horror, and the list goes on. Genres were originally assigned within film in 1946 by a French man called Nico Franck, as he introduced the term film noir, as he noticed how dark and often black settings and themes of these Hollywood films were. Film actually borrowed genre from literature, the radio, and music, and subconsciously there are certain expectations from genres that audiences will expect, such as horror giving the audience a feeling of fear, dread, and shock. So, how useful is genre theory? To answer that question, we firstly need to take a look into the horror genre, for instance. Horror films can be split up into many different subgenres: slasher films, paranormal films, psychological films, zombie films, and the list goes on. Now, this can actually cause a dispute between what genres actually are, because yes, all these films are horrors, but why are they all so different? This all leads to the problem that there are no set boundaries in place when defining a genre. Genres can therefore be seen as fuzzy categories, which cannot be defined by necessary and sufficient conditions. So, how do we actually define what a genre is? Well, let's take a look into some categories to define the film genre. Firstly, let's look into the use of mise-en-scene. So, within the majority of horror films, settings are typically very similar. They aim to have an eerie atmosphere around them. This can be done solely with the use of the visuals of the film. The uses of props and costumes and location add extra weight to this, as horror films can be located inside environments that the audience can live in, such as the film Halloween, where the serial killer Mike Myers goes around killing people within a small town. This can invoke fear within the audience, as these are places where they could potentially live. Or the environment could be set within creepy places like abandoned houses, and places where people typically don't visit, and have the main character visit them to create tension, such as the film House of the Witch, where a group of friends enter a house that's said to be haunted, where a few members of the group were thought to have set up some creepy things to scare the group purposely, but it turns out they never set anything up and it's actually just a witch that's killing and scaring everyone. However, in terms of genres, these films are just simply horror films, but some films are cross-genre, such as the film Shaun of the Dead. This, again, causes a problem with a defining genre. Take a look at this for example. On the IMDb page for Shaun of the Dead, it's simply said to be a horror comedy movie. However, if we delve into the opinions of Jeff Ramos from Polygon, he states, "In an hour and 40 minutes, Shaun of the Dead confirms it can be a romantic comedy, satire, zombie film, buddy comedy, action film, tragedy, tale of redemption, and the start of a trilogy." Which is why agreeing on genre can be so difficult, because genres seem to be completely subjective for each viewer. Looking further into this, can themes help define genre? There are many themes within horror, such as good versus evil, survival, childhood memories and demons, etc. These themes have one goal: to invoke the feeling of fear, dread and shock to their audience. Looking into themes further, you could argue that themes link heavily to the genre of the film. For example, a theme of demons can be heavily linked to paranormal films such as Paranormal Activity or The Exorcist. On the other hand, demons can also be linked to the fantasy genre, and the use of good and evil, or good versus evil, can be also attributed to both fantasy and horror. However, I believe it's the way that the film portrays these themes and what effects they aim to cause to the audience. If a film portrays demons to induce an extremely strong feeling of fear and shock, I believe that this theme has helped to define the horror genre. However, if a film doesn't portray the same theme of demons to induce an extremely strong feeling of fear and shock, then that theme hasn't helped to define the horror genre at all, and can be placed in a different genre. Can an editing style help us define genre? Typically, the editing style within horror films can heavily aim to scare the audience, so the use of jump scares are quite effective. Many horror films typically can use either non-diegetic or diegetic sounds to create a loud sound that scares the audience. Films such as The Woman in Black,
Take my hand.
It Follows, and The Conjuring all have jump scares within their films that are craftily edited to scare the audience, with a heavy build-up of non-diegetic music that's completely cut off to only have a loud sound effect play to reveal what's on screen to shock and scare the audience. Such as in Jaws, the famous
Shut off that engine.
is creating suspense and makes the audience fear that something is coming. I believe editing does help define a genre, as typically editing within a certain genre, such as horror, is very similar across most films, and is easily spotted when watching a horror movie. How the horror genre has changed over time. Filmmakers have been terrifying audiences for over 100 years. And with this, horror has changed over time. Films such as the 1960s Psycho, the 1920s The Thing, and Jaws are some classic films from the past that can struggle to hold up today. This is because we've probably all outgrown a film at some point too. Something that terrified us once seems cheesy when we watch it again. This is mainly due to us being much more exposed to gore and extreme violence than we were in the 70s and 80s. The use of CGI and effects in today's generation can make special effects used in past films not stand up to the feeling of fear that once terrified people. And this can make horrors from the past seem less scary than the ones in the present day. Can narrative plot points help define a genre? Narrative plot points can usually be very similar across genres, such as in slasher films. There's typically a serial killer on the loose that's going around usually chasing after young adults and killing them off. There are either two outcomes of this type of movie. Either there's usually one main character survivor, or there are no survivors left in the movie, allowing filmmakers to make a sequel if the film is perceived as good. Typically, the final character remaining is a girl. This is to make the serial killer or murderer feel more powerful. Films such as Halloween, Scream, Texas Chainsaw Massacre are other types of slasher films that follow this narrative structure, and these films were very successful at creating a franchise. Because of this, I do believe that narrative plot points within a film can help define a genre, as filmmakers often follow similar plot points within the film, but just change the way that these plot points are presented. Genre cycles. Genre cycles are known for having four main cycles: primitive, classical, revisionist, and parodic. And horror is no stranger to this. When horror was first introduced as a genre in film, it was seen as a primitive. As filmmakers were trying to figure out what to put within the horror genre, and audiences were trying to figure out what things to expect from the genre, such as the 3-minute 1896 first horror film, The Haunted Castle, which was a silent film, and the primitive stage lasted between the 1900s and the 1920s, as an influx of supernatural theme films followed, with many filmmakers, most of whom were still trying to find their feet with the new genre. Then horror hit its classical stage within the 1920s and 30s, which saw many classic films being produced, such as The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari in 1920 and Nosferatu in 1922, and later in 1931 with Frankenstein, and The Mummy in 1932. This was a time where audiences were starting to know what to expect from horror films, and filmmakers were starting to be able to deliver classic films that helped define the horror genre today. Then horror films moved to its revisionist stage in the 1970s and 1980s, where filmmakers were able to revise and refine the slasher subgenre by adding their own creative twists, which allowed these films to become franchises, such as Halloween, Nightmare on Elm Street, and Friday the 13th, then became the parody stage within horror, such as parody films like Scary Movie.
I'm gonna tell y'all the rules to survive this situation. Rule number 1.
Don't answer the phone.
I'm in the house. Do you know where I am?
You're behind the couch. I can see your feet.
Where filmmakers make fun of certain tropes within the horror genre. This in itself set off a parody franchise of scary movies that spanned across 5 different films. However, in the present day, the horror genre is currently back in its revisionist stage in the genre cycle, as audiences know what to expect from horror movies, and filmmakers are remaking classic horror films such as Halloween, and refining and developing new ways to scare audiences. This cycle can lead to genres like horror lowering in popularity, as film tropes can be overdone over time, and it can make the genre stale. Until filmmakers make new ways of creating films that give audiences the feelings of fear, dread, and shock. So, what's some of the positives and negatives of using genre? One positive is that it easily allows films to be put into categories that will be able to tell the audience what things to expect from within a film, such as gore, making the viewer feel dread or scared in horror, or even down to the editing style of films, such as jump scares within horror films. These conventions allow us to have a basic understanding of what's to come. However, this only becomes a negative when a film decides to overstep the boundaries, and makes changes within the film such as a shift in tone, themes or editing style that makes the film fall between 2 or more genres, making them cross-genre. While this isn't a bad thing, it makes putting certain films into definitive genres difficult, and can create differences in terms of people's opinions on what genre the film can land in. Another negative of genre is that genres evolve and change over time. Something that once scared us can be changed into a parody, such as the film Scary Movie, which is a parody of many different films within the horror genre. There are also cross-genre films that mix horror and other genres such as comedy, like Shaun of the Dead, to create a completely different type of zombie movie when compared to something like Dawn of the Dead. Conclusion. In conclusion, I believe that genre theory can be useful for films that are following classic film conventions, that stick to certain themes, visuals and editing styles that convey with that genre, such as films like Halloween and Friday the 13th. However, films that are going to test those boundaries and be different, such as horror films like Get Out and Shaun of the Dead, are much trickier to define, because yes, these films are horror films, but the way that they use a different tone, editing style, and use different themes makes them feel like something more than just a horror film.